Well, good afternoon. My name is Barry Williams, and I'm delighted to join your conference and have a chance to talk about board of directors. I actually listened in to the part of the last session, and I enjoyed that about how do you keep your sanity during this pandemic time. And I tell you that one of the things that I do is I've gotten addicted to Ancestry.com. And I am destroying family myths every day. So it starts out with, I'm not directly related to Pocahontas. Everybody's got the Indian story in their background, but doesn't seem to be true in my case, although I remember family stories like that. But I suggest things like Ancestry, and I also suggest I'm retaking Spanish. So just having little projects like that helps during these times. So today I mentioned that I want to talk about corporate boards. And I think it's highlighted that if you want to find out about my background, all you have to do is go to my webpage, which is barrylawsonwilliams.com. But my background in summary is that I attended business school. I actually graduated from business school in 1971. I'm very proud to say that my brother went to business school also, and my father-in-law went to business school. So we have several business school graduates in my family. Upon graduation, I went into management consulting with McKinsey, had a good stint there, and managed to work overseas close to 4 years in Latin America. Then I worked for a large private engineering construction company, Bechtel, where I worked in finance and investments. And then I started my own company in investments upon leaving Bechtel. So that's my background: strategic consulting, finance, and then investments. Along the way, and quite early, I got involved in serving in public company boards. My first board was in the early 1980s with American President Lines. It was a container shipping company. It still exists today, but it's owned by Singapore. So it's Neptune Orient Lines, but they keep the name. And I was not a CEO at the time. In fact, I was under 40. I did have not-for-profit board service, but I was an unlikely candidate. But I was recommended by an investment banker who I met through my service, and he had seen my leadership that I had exhibited on a not-for-profit board, and he recommended me for this for-profit board. So that's how I got on my first board. I've eventually served on 14 major public company boards, a couple of minor ones and a couple of private ones. But interesting enough, of those 14 boards, I only got on one of those boards through the executive search process using an outside executive search firm. Tanya, can I ask you to put up exhibit A3, entitled My Source of Recommendations to Boards? I just thought it'd be interesting to show you how I got on these various boards. Only one, as you see, was through search. The next 3 were from fellow board members, either not-for-profit, they were not-for-profit, and 2 from for-profit boards. The next category I got through outside consultants that I work with on boards who saw my work and then recommended me for additional boards. So accounting firms, compensation consultants, investment bankers. One you should never forget is a A business school classmate was on a board and recommended me to join a board of which he was a director. So keep up your business school connections and keep up your work connections, because the next category came from McKinsey alumni, people I knew when I was in McKinsey. And finally, twice I had the distinction of when a company on whose board I served was acquired, I was asked by the acquired company to serve on the surviving board. So you see, there's a rich source of recommendations of how I got on boards. I served on average on 5 boards at a time. And most of those boards I served for at least 10 years. 2 boards I served on for over 20 years. And at the same time, I probably served on average at 4 not-for-profit boards at the same time. So that's my board profile. And from that background, I want to speak about the challenges for diversity on corporate boards, which is my opening slide. And the goal, as I see it, is to have diversity, and I'm in particular today going to talk about racial representation, Black board members, to make our numbers sizable and sustainable. And I think the challenges are numerous for that happening. There are significant impediments, but I think we can overcome them with hard work. And certainly we have help from recent legislative regulatory mandates. So let's go back, next slide, to the corporation. Conventional wisdom was that if you wanted to get anything done in a corporation, you had to get the CEO involved. I think that has to be updated, because it's just as important to get the board involved, because corporate boards are increasingly involved in strategy review, succession planning, oversight, risk management, and public affairs. So the question is, next slide, who serves on these boards of major public companies? It starts with the CEO, and you often have the past CEO either serving as lead director or he could serve as chairman. And as a matter of fact, I found that 70% of people on these boards are either sitting or retired CEOs, chief operating officers, or CFOs. And the reason for the CFO is most boards have to have a financial expert on the audit committee, and a sitting or retired CFO fits that box. Most boards are about 8 to 12 people in size, and people serve for about 12 years. Your average board member is in their mid-60s, and they have about 6 or 7 more years to serve. All that is very important when we get to board rotation, because with that profile, less than 1 person on average rotates off a particular board per year. So there are very few openings. And again, just to finish off a profile of today's boards, it's mostly majority men. Women have made great gains in the last decade. So typically a board would have 1 minority and 2 females, 2+ females. So next slide. That's the composition of the board. And the question is, why is diversity important for these boards? And the key point I want to make is diversity is not just a response to some social injustice. Diversity is a business mandate. It goes beyond the social norm issue. It's a business imperative. Research has shown, and I'm dealing with my first point there, that if you have diversity of thought and diversity of experience, you will have better decision making. Harvard Business School has done studies, and they show that the more diverse companies, be it in senior management or on the board, they have better performance by several percentage points. Also, if you have a diverse board, you're going to better understand some of your market segments, some of the new market segments you want to pursue, some growth markets you want to emphasize. And it just goes that if you have people who represent those markets, you will have a better understanding of their characteristics and how to approach them. Increasing favorite of mine is in today's war on talent, you have to have a diverse company. And I'm talking about both minority talent and majority talent. My children's friends who are majority do not want to work for a company unless it has a good position on diversity, environment, issues like that. So companies are going to lose out for both majority and minority talent unless they address and embrace diversity. That is my 1, 2, 3 of why diversity is important. And now I believe diversity is more important for business than ever. And I say that because I believe that post-pandemic, and we'll get through this, businesses cannot go back to operating to how they operated before. They have to develop new business models, new approaches, new strategies. And I believe that diverse people with our different backgrounds can greatly contribute to that whole new development of models, strategies, approaches. Furthermore, if you look at the strategies that businesses are embracing now post-pandemic, you will see that they require a whole new set of skills. These skills are not necessarily the skills held by people who have traditionally occupied board seats. And we'll talk about some of these skills, but basically people are going to have to do a broader search. And if they look for the type of skills that I understand people are looking for, a great source will be younger people, younger, diverse people. So again, what I'm saying, why is diversity important? There are certain traditional arguments. I think it's more important than ever, and that's because of the need for new models, strategies, approaches post-pandemic. So let's go to the next slide. I talked a little bit about these boards. I said they are mostly male dominated. They're mostly CEOs. They're some women. But here's the picture. You look at the Fortune 100 or Fortune 200, it's the same. And I've updated this now. It's 20 to 25% of those companies still lack a Black director. They're making improvement post George Floyd and issues like that, but we still have at least 20% of those companies that lack a Black director. And we'll get into some of the impediments of overcoming that. If you look at the S&P 500, it's a higher number, 33%. If you look at the Russell 2000 in terms of companies, it's a higher number, it's 40%. And those, we're only talking about public companies. Let's look at private companies. And just to give you some background, there are 4 times as many private companies as there are public companies. In fact, public companies are on the decline in terms of total number. but there are 4 times as many private companies, and the numbers that lack a Black director are even higher than the 25 to 40% that we've talked about with the 3 other indices. Added to that worry is a significant number of today's seasoned Black corporate directors, of which I'm one, are facing retirement. I retired, and that meant I went off of 5 boards over a course of a couple of years, and 5 boards were faced with the opportunity to replace me. And I have to say, I found this surprising, but prior to George Floyd, and I'll talk about what's happening post George Floyd, is that the percentage of Black directors had been kind of the same for several years. The original mandate was carrying on, but there was no dramatic increase. So let's go to the post-George Floyd era and see what changes are happening. And it's more than just the individual George Floyd incidents. So I say George Floyd, etc. So first, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of diversity searches in which companies are asking at least to include a diverse candidate. There are also an increase in the filings that public companies make that talks about many things, their financials, risk management. There are also diversity disclosures, and we're not there yet because they tend to bunch all diversity in one group, and you can't tell what's happening, for example, with Black people individually, but companies are beginning to do more specific diversity disclosures. And then, as you've heard, more than a few companies have made financial commitments for diversity, multi-year, big dollar commitments. I've actually heard from search firms that they are getting searches which are exclusively for diverse candidates. So not just, as they used to say, the Rooney Rule in sports where you have to have one, but companies are saying, I want an all diverse search. And I found search firms saying, we will not undertake searches unless there's a diversity requirement. I find it interesting that some boards are selecting more than one minority at a time. When they see the wealth of talent, they're saying, why not one? Why limit it diversity to one seat? All search firms, and I ask you to look at this as an opportunity, they're begging me to identify candidates, minority candidates, Black candidates, even without any real experience, to join their firms so they can build their infrastructure around diversity. There's a lot more interest in board service, corporate board service, from a lot of people, particularly minority people, and from people who have not traditionally been interested in board service. And I'm talking about lawyers, and I'm talking about retired military. And finally, since George Floyd, there's sort of an awakening of this private company community, companies backed by private equity and venture capital. They are opening up to diversity in their boards, particularly during the IPO process. So let me just make a couple of comments about these pending or recently enacted legislative and regulatory mandates for diversity. They take many forms. Many exchanges are threatening delisting unless you disclose the amount of diversity you have in your board, management, what have you. Number two, JP Morgan, they announced that they are limiting IPO financing if the emerging board lacks diversity. California was the first state that actually had a requirement for diversity. It was gender diversity. Started in 2018, or you faced a fine. Now, more recently, number four, California has announced a requirement over the next several years for going beyond gender diversity and talking about further unrepresented people, and that focuses mostly on racial and ethnic diversity. There are two things that are pending that are awfully attractive. They're not enacted yet, but there's House legislation, House of Representatives at the federal level requiring diversity disclosures. Let's see what happens when it gets to the Senate. And similarly, the Biden campaign platform had a major initiative to create a diversity advisory committee with the SEC and to come back when a period of time and talked about recommendations for improving diversity on boards and in companies. And the final thing that's going on, and this is both NASDAQ and Glass Lewis, NISS too, Institutional Shareholder Services, they're talking about withholding voting for certain directors if the board lacks diversity. They are focusing on nominating and governance committees in particular. So next page, this is just a snapshot. This is a state initiative in the state of Illinois in 2019. They required annual reporting of gender, racial, and ethnic diversity of all boards that were headquartered in Illinois. So that was 74 publicly traded companies. And they found out that 19 did not have people of color and 6 didn't even have a female. So I want to skip slide 9 and come back to it later. Can we go to slide 10? One more. It's entitled, "What are the myths, misconceptions to increasing diversity?" And what I've encountered is 3. First, boards will tell you that there is a shortage of board-ready minority candidates. I strongly disagree that there's a supply issue. It's a relationship issue. These companies simply don't have access or don't have a relationship with board-ready minority candidates. The second thing is companies have this view, this perception that there is a diversity seat and there's only one diversity seat per board. And as someone has pointed out to me, all seats on a board are open to diversity. But you see the issue when you talk about board composition and how seats are filled by certain numbers of people and types, and they don't come up very often. That's going to be a challenge. And then finally, there's the feeling that, hey, we've done a lot with gender diversity, but gender diversity, as good as it is and as more as we have to do, is not the total answer. So next slide. What are the major challenges to increasing minority representation on corporate boards? And there are 6, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, but let's go to slide 12. The first one is the way boards conduct searches. As I indicated, Can we move to the way boards conduct searches? Thank you. As I indicated, most boards do internally driven searches, and that is they don't use an outside search firm. And it's combined with point two. What they do is they go around the table and they rely heavily on internal or recommendations that are people they know. So they're heavily driven. Three, you find that they have a bias for people who already serve on boards or who were or are CEOs. And finally, although boards sometimes do evaluations and update their skill sets, they have not updated their skill set requirements and built them into their search requirements. So let's go to the next slide, which is the second impediment. And that goes to how they conduct searches. As I said, there's a preference for those who already serve on boards, but there's also a strong preference for those already known by a board member, somebody who can vouch for you. And then there's an emphasis on having person with a good fit. So if you're going to get on a board, it comes down to three things. You have to be known by someone on that board or close to that board. You have to have the right skill set, and you have to be considered as a good fit. And a good fit is not negative. It doesn't mean that you have to not be yourself and be like everybody else on the board, but it does mean that you have to know when to listen, when to speak. It does mean you have to respect the views of others. It does mean you know how to work to get a consensus of the board to get things done. Okay, let's go to the third major challenge. That's the next slide. And that's one that I'm working hard on. And that is the lack of direct knowledge of the aspiring pool. If you map my board service, a lot of it relates initially to my service on not-for-profit boards. That's how I learned how boards work. That's where I learned to hone my board skills. That's where I exhibited leadership. And that's where I met people who actually also served on public corporate boards and who recommended me for public board service. Not only are people lacking exposure through not-for-profits, their corporates, our boards, and their leaders are not involved in the numerous emerging board effectiveness, board readiness programs. They probably spend too much time thinking they're going to meet people playing golf. And they are still reluctant to consider younger candidates, although, as I said, many of these younger candidates have the newly required skill sets that are so important. So let me go to the next slide and quickly say there are various vehicles for getting to know the aspiring candidates. There are 25 senior blacks in executive search, and that's a good start. There are at least 16 organizations newly focusing on identifying aspiring black candidates. Just so you know, I'm very involved with a small group of experienced black corporate directors. We are hosting our own digital list of aspiring black candidates. Okay, let me go because I definitely want to have some time for question and answer. But let me go to the next slide. It says limited board rotation. I think this is one of the big impediments to increasing minority representation on the boards. I said this before, there's only one board seat that comes up annually. Boards do not take advantage of periodic board evaluations and figure out what are the new skill sets they need. They don't retire people who've done a good job but don't necessarily have the skill sets needed to implement the strategies going forward for the future. And there's a reluctance to consider things like term limits and lower mandatory age. So board service is sort of like tenure. Similarly, next slide, there are limitations on board size. Most boards are 8 to 12 people, and I described that 70% are sitting or existing CEOs, CFOs, and COOs. There's a tendency to think that you don't have to go beyond that one diversity seat if you already have a woman. And there's pressure to accommodate the various diversity needs into one seat: ethnic, racial, gender, geographic. The next reason and last reason is these limited mandates given to search firms. They do now include diversity, but you have to understand that they didn't always, and therefore search firms are underinvested in developing an inventory of aspiring candidates. And I believe, very important, companies are not familiar with the various boutique search firms. They know the big five: Russell Reynolds, Spencer Stewart. But there are many boutique search firms, many started by people who served in the big firms and wanted to just do their own thing. And they handle quite big searches, and they are equally interested in diversity in the searches. So I'm going to try to wrap up to make sure we have questions. So let's go to the slide that says, should you be interested in corporate boards? And I'm going to ask the basic question: why are corporate boards attractive? And I think the most important, it's a chance to exercise your skills and make a contribution. And as you go forward in your business career, it's sort of the next step. Number two, it's certainly a chance to meet some very interesting people and do some interesting work, mainly strategy. Three, I stress that it's a giving experience, but it's also a learning experience. Four, it's somewhat lucrative. I have to say, in the Fortune 200 companies, I think average board compensation is in the 250 to 300 range. That's split between cash and equity. I chose to defer a lot of my board service fees, and that has come to be a significant part of my retirement resources. Fifth reason, it's a good vehicle for influencing corporate approaches to issues like diversity, environment, climate change, pay equity. And finally, if you're on the board, and you can really impact corporate spending policies in the areas of procurement and philanthropy. So are you a future board candidate? Before we do this, let me throw in a curveball. Can you go back to page 9? It says newly attractive skill sets for board service. Thank you. So this is my list when I talk to companies of what are the new skill sets. A corporate governance background, risk management, data analysis, data management, understanding of how to handle new markets, growth markets, international markets, background in IT security, privacy, financial expertise for the audit committee, certainly experience with technology and with the digital transformation, and then regulatory compliance background. this is just my list, but now we can go back to page 20. Are you a future board candidate? Just watching my time. Here's my list of how you should get ready for board service if you want to be a future board candidate. And it starts with inventorying your skills and matching them up with the skills that boards find attractive. The second is very important, very important. Develop a one-page resume. People are not interested in your merit badges when you were in the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. You need to simply tell them, why do you want to be on a board? What skill sets do you have? What do you want to do when you get on the board? What are some examples of your leadership? Who would recommend you? That's enough. If they're interested, they'll come after more. But I find, particularly with search firms, they're just going to put a 5-page resume on a pile. I think it's very important that you develop contacts both with large and the boutique search firms, and especially with some of the, I have 22, it's 25 Black executives in search. I think it's important that you get involved in board training courses to not only improve your board skills, but to join a network, to be part of an ecosystem, and to get on these aspiring lists. And there are programs. Atlanta Life Herndon has an awfully good program. Santa Clara has a good program. Stanford has a good program. Deloitte has a good program. The list goes on. Him for Her has a good program. Then you ought to identify a sponsor as well as a mentor. And I separate the two because I say a mentor listens to you, a sponsor does something for you, and you've got to distinguish between those two. And then continue to build your skill set. So let me just see if I've covered. I believe that I have covered everything I want, and I want to leave time for questions. So if I haven't covered something, it'll come up in the Q&A. But let's go to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. That was fantastic. We have quite a few questions that have come up in the Q&A. And we'll start with one at the top, which is, you mentioned that you consistently have held multiple board affiliations at one time. And there's a question about, how do you manage multiple board appointments? What are some of the concerns or some of the considerations you have when you're carrying multiple board affiliations?
Well, I'll give you a truly honest answer is I don't believe that I could serve on 5 boards at a time in today's board environment. Boards today are far more demanding of time and what have you. I think the goal should be 2 or 3. My view is that board service, each board takes 200 hours a year. That includes 4 board meetings, committee meetings, work in between boards, 1 strategy session. It adds up, and there's an awful lot of reading to be done. And I found a hard lesson that a lot goes on in between the board meeting, probably as much as happens within the board meeting. So it takes a lot of time. Now, I was fortunate I had my own company, so I could dictate my time. But I honestly don't believe I could do 5 at a time. Realistically, 2 or 3. And that's manageable. But remember, this is not your day job. You're taking away from your day job. And I warn people about that. But it's fun, interesting, lucrative. But you got to commit to 150 to 200 hours per board.
That's great advice. So you also discussed, and one of the other questions that's in the Q&A is your participation in nonprofit boards and how that prepared you or opened up access for you into for-profit boards, and maybe talk about the distinction between the two.
Well, first of all, let me give people a warning. There are not-for-profit boards and there are not-for-profit boards. So I am not recommending just any not-for-profit board. A lot of not-for-profit boards are 90% fundraising and are big boards where you can't really make a contribution. There are too many people in the room. But there are corporate not-for-profit boards who really function very much like for-profit boards. I wouldn't suggest to anybody that you go on a board simply as a stepping stone, a not-for-profit as a stepping stone to get on a for-profit board. But if you're interested, then I think you should, because you'll learn how boards operate. And some things about board service are counterintuitive. For example, in the boardroom, sometimes it's more important the question you raise rather than your view on a particular item. Sometimes it's more important to listen than to speak up. Other times it's more important to find your voice and speak up. So there are lots of things you can learn about board service by serving on not-for-profit boards. And as I said, the payload is if you have on that board people who are influential in the corporate world, they will be observing you and they will recommend you. And so that helps. Now, the problem I have with today's not-for-profits, a lot of them require a significant financial contribution. So get ready, get your wallet ready. But I found it an excellent training ground for for-profit board service.
There's a few questions I think that sort of all coalesce around a common topic, which is around, I guess if I put it in the vernacular, getting your foot in the door, in the sense of identifying that mentor, particularly if you're a younger individual, and being put on the list or being seen as an aspiring director. You talk a little bit about that. Any other guidance or thoughts you might have about individuals about how they become, if you like, people become aware of their interests and their talent?
Well, I'm a big believer that you have to get into this ecosystem. I don't have a name for it, but a diversity ecosystem. And I think the best way is to get into some of those board readiness programs that I talked about. And I forgot to mention McKinsey, who has more of a leadership program than a specific board readiness program, but it's a good way of getting your foot in the door. Second, we have to find a way for you to get to know the sizable number of existing Black directors. For years, I think from the beginning, I was a member of the Black Directors Conference, which was started mainly by Ariel Investments, but also Russell Reynolds. We'd meet once a year and we'd have 250 Black directors. We could be great mentors, sponsors for you. Third, I think you need to get your names on these lists that are circulating. I wish there was one list. I wish they were coordinated, but that's a fact of life. But they're so. And then finally, practically, I'd start tomorrow getting that one-page resume and getting that into, starting at least with the 25 Black professionals who are in search firms.
That's all fantastic advice. And I should note, individuals, that some of the organizations that Mr. Williams has identified, we've put links in the chat to those organizations so people can get some more information around them. I'm mindful of time, and perhaps I'll just wrap up with one last question. And I guess the question is thinking maybe that transition from being the executive who has the responsibility for the decision to the board director who has the governance responsibility. And having had both roles and served both roles simultaneously, what thoughts did you have for individuals about how they handle that nuance between the difference between the executive and the difference between the director?
Well, it's more than a nuance, because your job principally is oversight and governance, and management is to do the day-to-day. That having been said, you have to make sure management has the policies so that what they do day-to-day is consistent with good governance, good operations, and what have you. So it does require you to know a lot about what goes on day-to-day. And, as a director, you have to realize you're coming in 4 times a year, maybe 5. You only know the information that you receive from management, the public information you see from competitors, or information you receive as a result of your questions. So you got to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what are the questions you should be asking. And as I got into board service, I developed a little approach, which was I would read the material and come up with 3 questions and send them to management in advance and say, these are the issues I want to discuss. But it's very different for management and being in charge of the day-to-day. But I say the same thing because I had an interim CEO position. I was CEO of the American Management Association, and I had been a director of that organization. And when I became CEO, I was amazed at how little I knew what was going on in the company. So it's a transition.
Fantastic.
Ask important questions.
Well, I'm mindful of time, and I want to be respectful of your time as well as the time of the audience. This has truly been a great way to end the day. I think you've set the aspirations for the participants today and certainly opened our eyes to a pathway which oftentimes seems murky or unknown. But I think you've articulated quite clearly why this needs to be on the agenda and the aspirations for all the participants here. And certainly as a business school, it's important for us to know how we can be preparing people for that. And I should tell everybody that I had the great pleasure of introducing myself to Mr. Williams earlier this year. And I contacted him out of the blue. And based on I encourage everyone to go to his website and look at some of the fantastic research he's been doing in this particular space. It's getting coverage in Forbes and CNN and a whole host of other media outlets, the fantastic work he's doing around diversification of boards. And I just want to thank you for your graciousness in our conversation, but you didn't even hesitate when I asked you to join us for this first annual Black Management Association. And I really appreciate the support you're giving our organization, our school, and obviously the support you're giving more broadly to the community. So thank you very much for your time. And I just ask everyone in the audience in the appropriate format to celebrate and thank the contributions we've had today. And really, Mr. Williams, it's really a great pleasure to get to know you. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share your wisdom with us today.
Thank you. I hope to get invited back someday.
Trust me, that is definitely going to happen.